From their gesticulation and their shouts when they were near enough to be heard, we saw that something was the matter, and on taking them over the river, one of them, Lieutenant Ardendorf of Lonsdale's regiment, Natal native contingent, asking if I was an officer, jumped off his horse, took me to one side, and told me that the camp was in the hands of the Zulus, and the army destroyed, that scarcely a man had got away to tell the tale, and probably Lord Chelmsford and the rest of the column had shared the same fate. His companion, a carbineer, confirmed his story, and he was naturally very excited, and I am afraid I did not in the first quite believe him, and intimated that he probably had not remained to see what did occur. I had the saddle put on my horse, and while I was talking to Ardendorf, a messenger arrived from Lieutenant Bromhead, who was with his company at his little camp near the commissariat stores, to ask me to come up at once. I gave the order to inspan the wagon and put all the stores, tents, etc. I could get into it. I posted the sergeant and 6 men on the high ground over the pont behind a natural wall of rocks, forming a strong position from which there was a good view over the river and the ground in front, with orders to wait until I came or sent for them. The guard of natives had left some time before and had not been relieved. I galloped up at once to the commissariat stores and found that a pencil note had been sent from the 3rd column by Captain Alan Gardner to state that the enemy were advancing in force against our post. Bromhead had, with the assistant of Mr. Dalton, Dr. Reynolds, and other officers present, commenced barricading and loopholding the store building and the missionary's house, which was used as a hospital, and connecting the defence of the 2 buildings by wall of mealie bags, and 2 wagons that were on the ground. The native contingent, under their officer, Captain Stevenson, were working hard at this, and with our own men, and the walls were rapidly progressing. A letter describing what had happened had been sent by Bromhead by 2 men of the mounted infantry, who had arrived fugitives from Isandlwana, to the officer commanding at Helpmacar. These 2 men crossed the river at Fugitives' Drift with some others, and they have since reported to me they came to give notice of what had happened to us at Rorke's Drift, of their own accord, and without orders from anyone. I held a consultation with Bromhead, and with Mr. Dalton, whose energy, intelligence, and gallantry were of the greatest service to us, and whom, as I said in my report at the time, and I am sure Bromhead will unite with me in saying again now, I cannot sufficiently thank for his services. I went round the position with them, and then rode down to the ponts, where I found everything ready for a start. Ponts in midstream, hawsers and cables sunk, etc. It was at this time that the pontman, Daniels, and Sergeant Milne, 3rd Buffs, who had been employed for some time in getting the ponts in order and working with them under Lieutenant MacDowell of the Royal Engineers, killed at Isandlwana, offered to defend the ponts, moored in the middle of the river from their docks, with a few men. Sergeant Williams, 24th, and his little guard were quite ready to join them. We arrived at the commissariat store at about 3:30 p.m. Shortly afterwards, an officer of Durnford's horse reported his arrival from Isandlwana, and I requested him to observe the movements and check the advance of the enemy as much as possible, until forced to fall back. I saw each man at his post, and then sent them to work on again. Several fugitives from the camp arrived, and tried to impress upon us the madness of an attempt to defend the place. Who they were I do not know, but it is scarcely necessary for me to say that there were no officers of Her Majesty's army amongst them. They stopped the work very much, it being impossible to prevent the men getting around them in little groups to hear their story. They proved the truth of their belief in what they said by leaving us to our fate, and in the state of mind they were in, I think our little garrison was as well without them. As far as I know, but one of the fugitives remained with us, Ardendorf, for whom I have mentioned. He remained to assist in the defence, and from a loophole in the store building flanking the wall and hospital, his rifle did good service. There were several casks of rum in the store building, and I gave strict orders to Sergeant Windridge of the 24th Regiment, who was in charge, acting as issuer of commissariat stores to the troops, that the spirit was not to be touched. The man posted nearest to it would be considered to guard over it, and given fair warning was to shoot anyone, without altercation, who attempted to force his post, and Sergeant Windridge being there to see this carried out. Sergeant Windridge showed great intelligence and energy in arranging the stores of the defence of the commissariat store, forming loopholes, etc. The Reverend George Smith, vicar of Eastcourt, Natal, and acting army chaplain, went for a walk before the news of the disaster reached us, to the top of the Oscarberg, the hill behind Rorke's Drift. Mr. Witt, the missionary, went with him, or met him there. They went to see what could be seen in the direction of Isandlwana camp. He saw the force of the enemy which attacked us at Rorke's Drift cross the river in 3 bodies, and after snuff-taking and other ceremonies advanced in our direction. He had been watching them for a long time with interest, and thought they were our own native contingent. There were 2 mounted men leading them, and he did not realize that they were the enemy until they were near enough for him to see. He came running down the hill, and was agreeably surprised to find that we were getting ready for the enemy. Mr. Witt, whose wife and family were in a lonely house not very far off, rode off, taking with him a sick officer who was very ill in hospital and only just able to ride. Mr. Smith, however, although he might well have left, elected to remain with us, and during the attack did good service in supplying the men with ammunition. About 4:20 p.m, the sound of firing was heard behind the Oscarberg. The officer of Durnford's force returned, reporting the enemy close upon us, and that his men would not obey his orders, but were going off to help Makar, and I saw them, about 100 in number, going off in that direction. I have seen these same men behave so well since that I have spoken with several of their conduct, and all they said as their excuse was that Durnford was killed, and it was of no use. About the same time, Captain Stevenson's detachment of Natal native contingent left us. Probably most fortunately for us, I am sorry to say, that their officer, who had been doing good service in getting his men to work, also deserted us. We seemed very few now. All these people had gone, and I saw that our line of defence was too extended, and at once commenced a re-entrenchment of biscuit boxes, so as to get a place we could fall back upon if we could not hold the hoole. Private Hitch, 24th, was on top of the thatched roof of the commissariat store, keeping a lookout. He was severely wounded early in the evening, but notwithstanding, with Corporal Allen of the 24th, who was also wounded, continued to do good service. And they both, when incapacitated by their wounds from using their rifles, still continued under fire, serving their comrades with ammunition. We had not completed a wall 2 boxes high, when about 4:30 p.m. Hitch cried out that the enemy was in sight, and he saw them, apparently 500 or 600 in number, came around the hill to our south, and advanced at a run against our south wall. We opened fire on them, between 500 and 600 yards at first, a little wild, but only after a short time a chief on horseback was dropped by Private Dunbar of the 24th, and the men were quite steady, and the Zulus began to fall very thick. However, it did not seem to stop them, although they took advantage of the cover and ran, stooping with their faces near the ground. It seemed as if nothing would stop them, and they rushed on, in spite of their heavy loss, to within 50 yards of the wall, when they were taken in flank by the fire from the end wall of the store building, and met with such heavy direct fire from the mealie wall and the hospital at the same time that they were checked as if by magic. They occupied the cookhouse ovens, banks, and other cover, but their greater number, without stopping, moved to the left around the hospital, and made a rush at the end, and at our north-west line of mealie bags. There was a short but desperate struggle, during which Mr. Dalton shot a Zulu who was in the act of assegaiing a corporal of the Army Hospital Corps, the muzzle of whose rifle he had seized, and with Bromhead and many men they all behaved with great gallantry. The Zulus forced us back from that part of the wall immediately in front of the hospital, but after suffering very severely in the struggle, they were driven back into the bush around our position. The main body of the enemy were close behind the first force which had appeared, and had lined the ledge of rocks and caves in the Oscarberg overlooking us, and about 300 or 400 yards to our south, from where they kept up a constant fire. Advancing somewhat more to their left than to the first attack, they occupied the garden, the hollow road, and the bush in great force. The bush grew close to our wall, and we had no time to cut it down. The enemy was thus able to advance under cover close to our wall, and in this part soon held one side of the wall, while we held the other. A series of desperate assaults were made on the hospital, and extending from the hospital as far as the bush reached, but each was most splendidly met and repulsed by our men with a bayonet. Each time as the attack was repulsed by us, the Zulus close to us seemed to vanish into the bush, with some little distance off, keeping up a fire all the time. Then, as if moved by a single impulse, they rose up in the bush as thick as possible, rushing madly to the wall, some of them being already close to us, seizing where they could the muzzles of our men's rifles or their bayonets, and attempting to use their assegais to get over the wall. A rapid rattle of fire from our rifles, stabs with the bayonets, and in a few moments the Zulus were driven back, disappearing in the bush as before and keeping up their fire. A brief interval, and the attack would be made again and repulsed in the same manner. Over and over again this happened, our men behaving with the greatest coolness and gallantry. It is impossible for one individual to see all, but I particularly noticed myself the behaviour of Colonel Sergeant Bourne, 24th, Private McMahon, AHC, Privates Roy, Deacon, Bush, Cole, Jenkins of the 24th, and many others. Our fire at the time of these rushes of the Zulus was very rapid, Mr. Dalton dropping a man each time he fired his rifle, while Bromhead and myself used our revolvers. The fire from the rocks and the caves and the hill behind us was kept up all this time, and they took us completely in reverse, and although very badly directed, many shots came among us and caused us some loss. And about 6 p.m, the enemy extending their attack further to the left. I feared seriously they would get over our wall behind the biscuit boxes, and I ran with 2 or 3 men to this part of the wall, and was immediately joined by Bromhead with 2 or 3 more. The enemy stuck to this assault most tenaciously, and with their repulse and retiring into the bush, I called all the men inside our retrenchment, and the enemy immediately occupied the wall we had abandoned and used it as a breastwork to fire over. Mr. Byrne, acting commissariat officer, and who had behaved with great coolness and gallantry, was killed instantaneously, shortly before this by a bullet through the head, just after he had given a drink of water to a wounded man of the NNC. All this time the enemy had been attempting to fire the hospital, and at length had set fire to the roof and got in at the far end. I had tried to impress upon the men in the hospital the necessity for making a communication right through the building, but unfortunately this was not done. Probably at the time the men could not see the necessity, and doubtless also there was no time to do it. Without in the least detracting from the gallant fellows who defended the hospital, and I hope I shall not be misunderstood by saying so, I have always regretted, as I did then, the absence of my poor 4 sappers, who had only left that morning for Isandlwana and arrived there just to get killed. The garrison of the hospital defended it with the greatest gallantry, room by room, bringing out all the sick that could be moved, and breaking through some of the partitions while the Zulu were in the building with them. Privates Williams, Hook, R. Jones and W. Jones being the last to leave and holding the doorway with a bayonet, their ammunition being expended. Private Williams's bayonet was wrenched off his rifle by a Zulu, but with the other men he still managed with the muzzle of his rifle to keep the enemy at bay. Sergeant Reynolds carried his arms full of ammunition to the hospital, a bullet striking his helmet as he did so. But we were too busily engaged outside to be able to do much, and with the hospital on fire and no free communication, nothing could have saved it. Sergeant Maxfield, 24th, might have been saved, but he was delirious with fever, refused to move, and resisted the attempts to move him. He was assegaied before our men's very eyes. Seeing the hospital burning and the attempts of the enemy to fire the roof of the store, one man was shot, I believe, by Lieutenant Ardendorf, who had the light almost touching the thatch. We converted 2 large heaps of mealie bags into a sort of redoubt, which gave a second line of fire all around, in case the store building had to be abandoned, or the enemy broke through elsewhere. Assistant Commissary Dunn worked hard at this, and from his height, being a tall man, he was much exposed. In addition to the fact that the heaps were high above our walls, and most of the Zulu bullets, they went high. Trooper Hunter, Natal Mounted Police, escaping from the hospital, stood still for a moment, hesitating which way to go, dazed by the glare of the burning hospital and the firing that was going all around him. He was assegaied before our eyes, and the Zulu who killed him immediately afterwards falling. Whilst firing from behind the biscuit boxes, Dalton, who had been using his rifle with deadly effect, and by his quickness and coolness, and by means of saving many men's lives, was shot through the body. I was standing near him at the time, and he handed me his rifle so coolly that I had no idea until afterwards how severely he was wounded. He waited quite quietly for me to take the cartridges he had left out of his pockets. We put him inside our mealie sack redoubt building, and about this time I noticed Private Dunbar, 24th, making some splendid shooting, 7 or 8 Zulus falling on the ledge of rocks in the Oscarberg to many consecutive shots by him. I saw Corporal Lyons hit by a bullet which lodged in his spine, and fall beneath the opening we had left in the wall of biscuit boxes. I thought he was killed, but looking up he said, "Oh, sir, you are not going to leave me here like a dog." We pulled him in and laid him down behind the boxes, where he was immediately looked at by Reynolds. Corporal Scammell, of the Natal native contingent, who was badly wounded through the shoulder, staggered out under fire again from the store building, where he had been put, and gave me all his cartridges, which in his wounded state he could not use. While I was intently watching to get a fair shot at a Zulu who had appeared to be firing rather well, Private Jenkins, 24th, saying, "Look out, sir," gave my head a look down just as a bullet whizzed over me. He had noticed a Zulu who was quite near in another direction, taking a deliberate aim at me. For all the man could have known, the shot might have been directed at himself. I mention these facts to show how well the men behaved, and how they loyally worked together. Corporal Sheese of the Natal native contingent, who was a patient in the hospital with a wound in the foot which caused him great pain, behaved with greatest coolness and gallantry throughout the attack, and at this time creeping out a short distance along the wall we had abandoned, and slowly raising himself to get a shot at some of the enemy who had been particularly annoying. His hat was blown off by a shot from a Zulu on the other side of the wall. He immediately jumped up, bayoneted the Zulu, and shot a second, and bayoneted a third who came to their assistance, and then returned to his place. As darkness came on, we were completely surrounded. The Zulus wrecked the camp of the Company 24th and my wagon that had been left outside, in spite of the efforts of my batman, Driver Robson, the only man of the Royal Engineers with us, who had directed his particular attention to keeping the Zulus off this wagon, in which there were, as he described it, our things. They also attacked the east end of our position, and after being several times repulsed, eventually got into the kraal, which was strongly built with high walls, and drove us to the middle, and then to the inner wall of the kraal, the enemy occupying the middle wall as we abandoned it. This wall was too high for them to use effectively to fire over, under Zulu no sooner showing his head over it when he was dropped, being so close that it was almost impossible to miss him. Shortly before this, some of the men said they saw redcoats coming on the Helpmakar road. The rumour passed quickly round. I could see nothing of the sort myself, but some men said they could. A cheer was raised, and the enemy seemed to pause, to know what it meant, and there was no answer to it. And darkness came. It was very strange that this report should have been arisen amongst us, for the 2 companies 24th from Helpmakar did come to the foot of the hill, but not, I believe, in sight of us. They marched back to Helpmakar on the report, saying Rorke's drift had fallen. After the first onslaught, the most formidable of the enemy's attacks was just before we retired behind our line of biscuit boxes, and for a short time after it, when they had gained great confidence in their success on the hospital. Although they kept their positions behind the walls we had abandoned, and kept up a heavy fire from all sides until about 12 o'clock, they did not actually charge up in a body to get over the wall after about 9 or 10 o'clock. After this time, it became very dark, although the hospital roof was still burning. It was impossible from below to see what was going on, and Bromhead and myself, getting up on the mealie sack redoubt, kept an anxious watch on all sides. The enemy were now in strong force all around us, and every now and then a confused shout of "Usutu" from many voices seemed to show that they were going to attack from one side, and immediately the same thing would happen on the other, leaving us in doubt as to where they meant to attack. About midnight, or a little after, the fire slackened, and after that they kept us constantly on the alert by feigning as before to come on at different points. The fire was of a desultory character. Our men were careful, and only fired when they could see fair chance. The flame of the burning hospital was now getting low, as pieces of the roof fell, or hitherto unburnt parts of the thatch ignited. The flames would blaze up, illuminating our helmets and faces. A few shots from the Zulus replied to by our men, and again silence, broken only by the same thing repeatedly happening. This sort of thing went on until about 4 a.m., and we were anxiously waiting for daybreak and the renewal of the attack, and at length there was complete silence. But at daybreak our enemy were out of sight over the hill to our southwest. One Zulu had remained in the corral and fired a shot amongst us, without doing any damage, as we stood on the walls and ran off in the direction of the river, although many shots were fired at him as he ran, and glad to say the plucky fellow got off. Taking care not to be surprised by any ruse of the enemy, we patrolled the ground around the place, collecting the arms and ammunition of the dead Zulus. Some of the bullet wounds were very curious. One man's head was split open, exactly if done with an axe. Another had been hit just between the eyes, the bullet carrying away the whole of the back of his head, leaving his face perfect, as if it were a mask, only disfigured by a small hole made by the bullet passing through. One of the wretches we found, one hand grasping a bench which had been dragged from the hospital, and sustained thus in the position we found him in, while the other hand he still clutched the knife which he had mutilated one of our poor fellows, whom which he was still leaning. We increased the strength of our defences as much as possible, strengthening and raising our walls, putting sacks on the biscuit boxes, etc., and were removing the thatch on the roof of the commissariat store to avoid being burnt out in case of another attack, when about 7 a.m. a large body of the enemy, I believe the same who attacked us, appeared on the hills to the southwest. I thought at the time that they were going to attack us, but from what I now know from Zulus, and also of the number we put hors de combat, I do not think so. I think that they came up on the high ground to observe Lord Chelmsford's advance, and from there they could see the column long before it came in sight of us. A frightened and fugitive auxiliary came in shortly before, and I sent for Daniels the pontman, who could speak Zulu, a little to interview him. Daniels had armed himself with Spaulding's sword, which he flourished in so wild and eccentric a manner that the poor wretch thought his last hour had come. He professed to be friendly, and had escaped from Isandlwana, and I sent him with a note to the officer commanding at Helpmacar, explaining our situation and asking for help. For now, although the men were in excellent spirits, and each man had a good supply of ammunition in his pouches, we only had about a box and a half left, besides, and at this time we had no definite knowledge of what had happened, and I myself did not know that the part of the column which Lord Chelmsford had taken any part in the action at Isandlwana, or whether on the camp being taken he had fallen back on Helpmacar. The enemy remained on the hill, and still more of them appeared. When about 8 a.m. the column came in sight, and the enemy disappeared again. There were a great many of our native levies with the column, and the number of redcoats seemed so few that at first we had grave doubts that the force approaching was the enemy. We improvised a flag, and our signals were soon replied to from the column. The mounted men crossed the drift and galloped up to us, headed by Major Cecil Russell and Lieutenant Walsh, and were received by us with a hearty cheer. Lord Chelmsford, with his staff, shortly after rode up and thanked us all with much emotion for the defence we had made. The column arrived, crossing by the ponts, and we had a busy time in making a strong position for the night. I was glad to seize an opportunity to wash my face in a muddy puddle, in company with Private Bush of the 24th, whose face was covered with blood from a wound in the nose caused by the bullet which had passed through and killed Private Cole of the 24th. With the politeness of a soldier, he lent me his towel, or rather a very dirty half of one, before using it himself, and I was very glad to accept it. In wrecking the stores in my wagon, the Zulus had brought to light a forgotten bottle of beer, and Bromhead and I drank it with mutual congratulations on having come safely out of so much danger. My wagon driver, a Cape man, had lost his courage on hearing the first firing around the hill. He let loose the mules and retreated, concealing himself in one of the caves of the Oscarberg. He saw the Zulus run by him, and to his horror some of them entered the cave he was in, and lying down, commenced firing at us. The poor wretch was crouching in the darkness in the far depths of the cave, afraid to speak or to move, and our bullets came into the cave, actually killing one of the Zulus. He did not know from whom he was in the most danger, friends or foes, and came down in the morning looking more dead than alive. The mules we recovered. They were quietly grazing by the riverside. On my journey homewards, on arriving at the railway station in Durban, I asked the porter to get me some help to carry my bags to the hotel. He sent several, and the first to come running up was my Volupa boy, who had taken me up to Rorke's Drift. He stopped short and looked very frightened, and I believe at first he thought he saw a ghost. I seized him to prevent him running away, and when he saw that I was flesh and blood, he became reassured. He said he thought I had been killed, and upon my asking him how he thought I'd got away, he said, the solution of the mystery just striking him, "I know you rode away on the other horse. As far as I could learn, and according to my own story, the boy had taken the horse I rode up from the river to the commissariat store, and wild with terror, had ridden it over to Pietermaritzburg without stopping, where he gave it over to the transport people. But having no certificate to say who he was, they took the horse from him and would not give him any employment." Gunner Howard of the Royal Artillery ran out of a burning hospital through the enemy and lay down on the upper side of the wall in front of our north parapet. The bodies of several horses that had been killed early in the evening were lying there, and concealed by these and the Zulu bodies in the low grass and bushes, he remained unseen with the Zulus all around him until they left in the morning. And Private Beckett of the 24th Regiment escaped from the hospital in the same direction. He was badly wounded with assegais in running through the enemy. He managed to get away, concealed himself in a ditch of the garden, where we found him the next morning. The poor fellow was so weak from the loss of blood that he could not walk, and he died shortly afterwards. Our mealie bag walls were afterwards replaced by loopholed walls of stone, work making rapid progress upon the arrival of the 5th Company of the Royal Engineers, with Lieutenant Porter. As soon as the sappers arrived, we put a fence around, and a rough wood cross over the graves of our poor men who were killed. This was afterwards replaced by some neat stone monument, an inscription by the 24th, who remained to garrison the place. I have already in my report said how gallantly all behaved, from Lieutenant Bromhead downwards, and I also mentioned those whom I had particularly noticed to have distinguished themselves. On the day following, we buried 351 bodies of the enemy in graves not far from the commissariat buildings. Many bodies were since discovered and buried, and when I was sick at Ladysmith, one of our sergeants from Rorke's Drift came down and said where he was employed in the construction of Fort Melville, told me that many Zulu bodies were found in the caves and among the rocks a long distance from the mission house when getting stone for the fort. As in my report, I underestimated the number we killed, so I believe I also underestimated the number of the enemy that attacked us, and what I have learnt since, I believe the Zulus must have numbered at least 4,000.